Let's talk about the messy middle.
Let's do it. Which, by the way,
Okay.
I believe 80% of business and life are yellow. So I
Yes.
absolutely want to talk about that.
Okay. So I understand one or the other is not a green light, right? But it's
Correct.
okay. If one is not a green light, is it not a red light?
Okay. Let's break down the two types of yellow lights. One type is when the head is on board and the heart is not. And then obviously the vice versa. Heart is in and heart is out, or head is out. Okay. So the one that I believe we deal with a lot more often is when our head is on board, but our heart is not. So a couple examples. We're talking to a lot of leaders right now.
Yeah.
I used to lead massive sales teams opening billion-dollar stadiums in the NFL and beyond. And we all know that sometimes you have a high performer and a high producer, but they're a little toxic in the team, especially in the sales world. A lot of your alpha producers aren't always the nicest ones in the sandbox. And so if that's the case, your head is on board because you want to keep their production. You want to sell all the widgets, but your heart knows that they're not a keeper. So your head says keep them, your heart says they're not a keeper, and that yellow light can be more deadly than a red, because at least a red light, snap, you're out. It's done. If I break up with a person that hey, my head is in, but my heart is out, we're done. I'm not losing another day of my life because of this relationship. But when that person hangs out in your business locker room for 3, 4, 5 years because you wanted to sell more widgets, think about the domino effects it has on your culture. Think about those cultural effects creating retention problems, engagement problems, recruiting problems, all these things that are the organizational health. It's because we hung out in long-term yellows, and those yellows where only the head is on board, those are silent killers. And the last piece I'll share on that yellow is that if you think about which changes more often, head or heart, the science shows the heart doesn't change. Your heart is not going to change day to day, week to week, month to month. It knows what it knows. It knows the truth. It knows the authentic lens that you should have, but we don't always act on that authenticity. And so the point being, if your heart's not going to change, that's why this long-term yellow is more deadly than a red. It's never going to not be a yellow. Never. But on the flip side, let's say your heart is in, but the head hasn't joined for the party. That I would ballpark 90% of the time. There are some exceptions, and the exceptions are mainly around family, around people you love, that sometimes there isn't a happy ending to that story. So we could just put that aside and say there's a very small percentage of yellow lights where the heart is in, but it still might never get to green, but it's a small percentage. The majority, my recommendation, I know you do a lot of coaching. My recommendation for when your heart is in is stay in the fight. You stay in the fight. Maybe you have to overcome some self-limiting beliefs. Maybe you have to hire a coach. Maybe there's a therapist. Maybe there's a conversation with a spouse. Maybe whatever it is, you stay in the fight, because it's so hard to find things where your heart is in. You shouldn't ruin that. You shouldn't walk away from that signal and from that cue. And it might not be a direct action the next day, but if we can work through getting our head on board, then that is a yellow light where your heart is in, that one day will be green if you put in the work.